Good evening and welcome everyone to the second public information meeting of the Wellington Circle Study. My name is Michaela Niles. I'm the MassDOT project manager for this effort, and I'm joined today by members of the consultant team. I would like to open with a few procedures for tonight's meeting. First, please note that this virtual public meeting is being recorded. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcript. And by continuing attendance with this virtual public meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. All recordings and chat transcripts will be considered a public record. If you are not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera, keep your microphone muted, and refrain from utilizing the Q&A. We have interpreters who are translating tonight's meeting into Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. If you require this service, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, the globe icon, and select which language you wish to hear. At this moment, I would ask all English speakers to select English as their chosen language. This will allow you to hear translated non-English comments during Q&A. To utilize the ASL services, to share any comments or questions, please let the study team know through the Q&A, and the team will provide video sharing capabilities. You can view closed captions by selecting the closed captions feature and selecting either show subtitle or view full transcript. Show subtitle will display captions at the bottom of your screen, and view full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription in a window to the right. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the presentation. To participate, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or if you are participating by phone, you may dial *9. A member of the study team will then unmute you so you may share your question or comment verbally. You may also submit comments or questions at any time in writing using the Q&A. And if you need technical assistance, please reach out to Sarah from the project team at stoja@htb.com or contact Zoom technical support at 888-799-9666. So now, as part of today's agenda, we'll have a brief overview of the study process. Then we'll review the issues and opportunities, as well as the alternatives development and review process. Next, we'll present the alternatives analysis, and from there, we'll open it up to questions or comments. And finally, we'll outline the next steps for the study. So as a brief overview of the study background, this is a conceptual planning study to evaluate the existing and future multimodal conditions at Wellington Circle. This process includes examining ways to redesign the circle to provide better connectivity and improve mobility within the city of Medford and the surrounding region. And based on the analysis and the feedback received over the course of the study, short, medium, and long-term recommendations will be developed and included in a draft final report that will be released for public comment, then finalized in a final report. And so as we move to the next slide, it really details the goals and objectives of our study, which were developed at the onset of the process. And these are carried throughout the study and have helped to guide the alternatives development. The primary goals for this effort are to improve safety and mobility for all transportation modes and users in the Wellington Circle area, improve quality of life for residents, and improve local and regional connectivity. And so in terms of the process itself, the study chart on your screen details the study tasks, with each step building upon the previous one. And the step highlighted in orange indicates where we are now. And as I mentioned today, we are discussing the alternatives analysis. And so with that, I will hand it over to Gary McNaughton of the consultant team to review the issues and opportunities. Gary?
Thank you, Michaela. And I'm going to run through the issues and opportunities, and also then walk through a little bit of an overview of the alternatives in the development process that led us to those alternatives that went through the analysis that we'll spend most of our evening talking about. With regards to the issues, constraints, and considerations, they're well known. The challenges with the circle, there's a number of deficiencies that make it difficult to travel through the circle and challenging for any mode. Vehicles encounter excessive delays. multiple lanes that are turning, creating various conflicts and safety concerns. Pedestrian and bicyclists encounter uncomfortable conditions. There's really, no accommodations for bicycles through the circle. Pedestrians, it's certainly a daunting area to cross, and we've heard numerous folks telling us how they would drive from one side of the circle to the other rather than walking because of how uncomfortable it is. And as we develop these alternatives, we also have to consider some of the physical constraints. There's historic elements of the corridor. There's environmental concerns and areas that we want to make sure that we're not having negative impacts on those criteria as well. Next slide. But the circle does offer us a number of opportunities. There's a very wide right of way in the area that gives us the ability to look at a number of alternatives without impacting abutting private property. There's changing land uses and abutting open space that gives us opportunities to connect into those properties better, provide opportunities for walking and biking that can better utilize the infrastructure through the circle to take better advantage of those surrounding land uses. And all of these together, we think we can make improvements that will reduce congestion, provide healthier, safer transportation options through the circle and for the surrounding area. And those are really some of the goals that you'll hear more about later in the presentation. So the alternatives development process, it really starts at the very beginning, looking at very basic alternatives and concepts. But it's a lengthy process. We're starting with very simple concepts, focusing on vehicle movements. And, while that's not some of the primary goals of this study, really focusing on vehicles is a starting point because they're the least flexible. They're the hardest to accommodate and analyze in a number of ways. So we start from that perspective. We run it through a fatal flaw screening. If it's something that becomes completely unacceptable, we've deleted it at that point, and we're no longer advancing that further. But those that did show promise and showed that, we think we can make this one work, we then started to assess them for pedestrians, bicycles, and transit, started adding, looking at the ability to add in infrastructure for those modes. And in some instances, if we weren't able to accommodate those modes, that became a fatal flaw, and those concepts then fell out of the mix. And those that did pass and showed promise for all modes were identified as the feasible concepts, and those are the ones that were subject to the detailed analysis against the project goals. Next slide. So the basic concepts, we start simple, try to look at, this is a complex circle intersection with a number of complex movements through the circle. What if we just make it a simple intersection? Just bring the roadways together in a 5-legged intersection, simply remove Middlesex Ave so that you have a couple of, traditional intersections, a 4-way and a 3-way. And what we find is that, not surprisingly, these configurations would increase delay, would require even more lanes to make vehicle operations even close to acceptable. So, they were discarded, but the separation of Middlesex from the primary intersection from the Parkway did show some promise, and you'll see elements of that in the alternatives that we did develop. Next slide. From there, we started looking at different intersection configurations and what we could do to make things work for all modes through the circle. So we did look at, sticking with a circular configuration, looking at roundabouts, whether it was a singular roundabout or multiple roundabouts, looking at multi-lane roundabouts. And really what happened with any of the circular configurations, because of the travel patterns that we see through here, you end up creating more conflicts than you have under the existing conditions, and you're putting the highest volume moves in conflict with each other. And you ended up with a large number of circulating lanes, entering lanes, things that make it very inhospitable for pedestrians and bicyclists, and honestly don't do a very good job for vehicles either. So we moved away from any of the circular and roundabout concepts. From there, and you can go to the next slide, we started to look at more advanced intersection configurations. Could we look at, jug handles, some different ones that you may not be familiar with, the restricted crossing U-turn or an R-cut, where you're not allowed to go straight through from the side street. Everybody's turning right, and then you're either going downstream and U-turning or going on to your destination in a different direction. We looked at continuous flow intersections, where you have intersections on the periphery that allow left turns to cross over through movements, so that when you get to the primary intersection, that that traffic can all flow at the same time and you're maximizing capacity. That one showed some promise, but actually had a lot of challenges for pedestrian and bicycle accommodations, and we ultimately moved away from that one as well. The R-cut had a high volume of U-turning vehicles that made it implausible to implement the R-cut treatment. And the jug handles really just relocated conflicts, but didn't do anything to improve upon or solve any of the traffic flow. The fourth configuration that we looked at was the quadrant roadway, and that one did show some promise. As you'll hear, the primary traffic flow through here, the heaviest traffic flow, is really from the south to the east, and then the reverse movement. So the quadrant roadway allowed us to provide a more direct connection for those movements that did show some promise, and you'll see that carried forward into the alternatives. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yep. So after we got through the initial concepts and started to work out some very basic ideas of how, what may be feasible for the intersection, we worked with the regional planning agency and their technical division, CTPS, the Central Transportation Planning staff, and they work with the regional travel demand model. So they're giving us the estimates of future traffic volumes, both with and without the project. And they do continue to show growth in traffic volumes, but we didn't necessarily let that drive our design. A lot of our concept development work was done with existing volumes, and then we were testing things with those future volumes. And we'll talk about some of the traffic volume growth and some of the limitations for accommodating that, and things that may need to be thought of a little bit differently as some of that development occurs and potential traffic volume growth is underway. We did use a lot of that time and a lot of that analysis to refine the cross sections. We refined the analysis to show access to abutting properties. We tweaked lane designations. We added accommodations for sidewalks and bike lanes, and again, made sure that we were able to accommodate all of the abutting properties and the driveway access that we needed. You'll also see an alternative that was transit enhanced, looking to improve bus operations through the area that we carried forward. And then you'll see on some of the alternatives, we're missing one of the key crossing locations just due to the nature of the traffic flow and what we're able to make successful in the alternatives. So we looked at the potential for a pedestrian bridge in those crossing locations. Next slide. So now I'll start presenting the various elements of the alternatives that were advanced into the analysis stage. And then once I'm done walking through the alternatives, we'll start talking about the detailed analysis. All of these are very preliminary designs, so there's a long way to go in design development. These are based on aerial imagery and GIS level mapping. So any of the alternatives that move forward into more detailed design, there'll be real ground survey, there'll be much more detailed assessment of right-of-way, more vertical design, investigation, utilities, et cetera. So I just wanted to put that caveat out there that there is a long way to go, and these are very conceptual at this point. So we started looking at some of the short and medium term alternatives. What could we do to improve upon the existing intersection configuration without completely changing everything? And this, what you see on the screen, is what we're referring to as option A, which was a compilation of several a la carte type treatments that we had developed through the process. We heard feedback that the free right turns, those separated right turns that you see, there's still one in the northbound in this image, but the eastbound has that swooping right turn that's able to be navigated at a fairly high speed for vehicles in front of the state police facility. Similarly, you have one in the southbound direction, and you'll notice those are all removed except that northbound right turn, which is one of the heaviest movements in the corridor and really does need to remain separated. We also took Middlesex Ave out of the primary intersection, as I mentioned earlier, and we have that connecting to Fellsway to the north through a series of new intersections up in that area. The other thing that you'll notice on this is the eastbound left turn is no longer there. We're prohibiting that in the primary intersection, but it can be accommodated through the U-turn just to the south of this image and off the screen. And this combination of improvements does a number of things. It opens up a large swath of open space, as you see on the north side of the circle. It shortens some of the crossing widths for pedestrians. It has a limited ability to provide some bicycle accommodations in the eastbound direction. And this does provide some improvement for some vehicle flow and better organizing things. But the right turn operations were degraded quite a bit with this alternative. And you will note on all of the alternatives that I'll walk through, there is a cost estimate at the bottom of the screen. All of those cost estimates are done in today's dollars, current construction estimates. We normally would have projected those out, and what we were seeing is, the escalation being what it is today was starting to kind of skew the picture a little bit. And we wanted to be able to, at this stage, have an apples to apples comparison. And we weren't looking at development time if a project alternative was going to take several years longer just to develop. We didn't want to have that skewed. So just a note that all of those cost estimates are in current dollars. And by the time we got to construction, cost may be higher depending on how inflation continues at that time. So as I noted, we saw a lot of delays with the right turn movements by removing those separated right turns. So we developed option B, which you'll see simply restores the eastbound and westbound right turn, separated right turns. Although in the eastbound direction, we would tighten it up and make it a little less sweeping, something that's not quite as high speed and able to better accommodate peds and bikes in a lower speed environment. And we would signalize it as well, so pedestrians and bicyclists would have a protected crossing. So we are seeing some benefits to pedestrians and bicyclists. We are able to shorten some of those crossing distances. We're getting some of the same benefits in open space. And again, the cost is really essentially the same between these two alternatives when you work them both out. So, these show some promise without major construction, but they don't accomplish a lot of the project goals. The westbound approach coming in is unchanged. Much of the inner part of the circle is unchanged, except for the elimination of that eastbound to northbound left turn. So, it offers some benefits, but doesn't get as far as we wanted to. So we then moved on to the long-term alternatives. And we had a series of both at grade and grade separated alternatives that we had looked at. But when you start with looking at the existing circle, one of the things to note is, the number of lanes, and keep that in mind as we're going through this. You have 6 and 7 lanes on each approach. You have, 2 and sometimes 3 turning lanes that, we've heard a lot of feedback about how challenging those are for not only for pedestrians and bicyclists, but even for vehicles. And we really were tasked with trying to improve some of those conditions. And you'll see a lot of the alternatives use fewer lanes than what exists out there within the circle today. So if you go to the next slide, the first at grade alternative that we advanced was the square concept, and so named due to the configuration of the open space on the north side of the parkway. You'll notice some of the key elements of this concept are the quadrant roadway that I talked about earlier in the basic concept. So you'll see from that south section of the Fellsway over to Revere Beach Parkway to the east, we have a new connector roadway or quadrant roadway. We have elements of that to the north connecting up to Middlesex Avenue as well. But the primary north-south configuration for this alternative is the Fellsway straight through. If you're on the Fellsway and you're continuing, it's a straight through movement. There's no need to turn off of that. But this does provide a direct connection between Revere Beach Parkway and Fellsway to the south, which is some of the heaviest traffic flow that we see. You'll see a number of locations with fewer lanes than what you see out there today. and with medians that separate those pedestrian crossings so that you're not crossing 7 lanes at a time or more. You're crossing 3 lanes before you're at least coming to a refuge area along that. We are able to add in pedestrian and bicycle accommodations. So the blue, the light blue aqua color is sidewalks, and then the tan, the light blue is the bicycle connections and sidewalk level facilities. And then the tan are the sidewalk or walking paths that we're able to add throughout. So you'll notice those throughout the project area. As I noted, the one missing crosswalk on that east side of the intersection along Revere Beach Parkway. Due to the nature of this intersection configuration and the operations of the signal, there is no ability to accommodate that pedestrian crossing. So you'll notice that's not in these at-grade alternatives, and that's where we started looking at the grade separated alternative that I'll touch upon. So if you go to the next slide, this is really the other at-grade alternative and called the triangle, again, based on the configuration to the north of the parkway itself. This one really shifts the Fellsway so that its primary connection is onto Revere Beach Parkway. If you're coming down the Fellsway, you're going straight through, you're going to be going on to Revere Beach Parkway. If you want to continue southbound on Fellsway, you're going to be turning right to then go straight through. This one does a good job of connecting those heavy movements, the heavy flow, does a nice job of doing the same things with narrower crossings, medians to provide a break for pedestrians, the ability for additional space for pedestrians and bicyclists throughout the roadway network to fill in some of the gap that we see throughout, within the bicycle network and that pedestrian connectivity through the area. The one element that is common to both, and I didn't mention this on the square concept, is the eastbound left turn is eliminated within the intersection itself. And really, those movements would be accommodated at Commercial Street. If you're accessing into the retail center, there's still the ability to make that movement, but the left turn at the intersection itself would no longer be there. So if you go to the next slide, this is where we talk about, and then this is the transit enhanced alternatives. So we're also tasked with trying to make improvements to transit. And while the at-grade alternatives would allow for transit to exist and to move through the intersection areas, we really wanted something that we could build upon and make significant improvements for transit. So the triangle alternative actually is better suited to transit because of the primary bus routes as they exist today. And we understand there are some proposals within the bus network redesign that the MBTA is finalizing that would increase the east-west bus flow. And there's abilities to adapt this if those are carried forward. But this alternative focuses on the bus movement along the Fellsway over to Wellington Station. And what you see in red there are dedicated bus lanes that could be added. So southbound throughout the project limits along Fellsway, we would have a dedicated bus lane that is an added lane over the base triangle alternative all the way down through the intersection. And then in the northbound or the westbound and northbound direction, we would have a dedicated lane that would run up through the connector road that ties into Middlesex Ave. It could be continued further north. We just we're running it within the project limits, but there is space along Fellsway if that were to be continued further north. Beyond that, this is identical to the triangle alternative with the same other pedestrian and bicycle enhancements. It's just those added improvements for transit service. And again, missing that crosswalk on the east side of the intersection with Revere Beach Parkway. So if you go to the next slide, this is where we start. There's a lot of desire to try to keep a crossing there. It's not feasible to do it at grade. So can we do it in a grade separated fashion? Some of the challenges with grade separating pedestrian crossings, particularly in this area, is, it's going to be a long structure. That's a long distance to span. So it ends up being a fairly sizable structure in order to span that distance. And due to accessibility requirements, you end up needing ramps to get up to it. There would also be stairs nearer to the intersection so that folks aren't required to do the long ramps to wind their way up there, but you still have to have all of those ramps in place for accessibility. So when you look at this bridge and the pedestrian bridge, it ends up costing nearly as much as the at-grade alternatives themselves, but it does provide a much needed connection. So that is part of our evaluation, and this can be added on to either of the at-grade alternatives. It's not exclusive of either of them. The other alternative that we looked at was a grade separated with an intersection that carries the amount of volume that this one does. Grade separation is a natural concept to consider. And some of the uniqueness with this is really the primary movement, the heaviest movement from the south to the east doesn't necessarily lend itself as well to grade separation. Doing curved structures presents some unique challenges. And it also, as we started to look through it, it really didn't end up solving a lot of the problems because it leaves a lot of things at grade that presented their own challenges. So as we looked through the different grade separation alternatives, we ended up with grade separating the east-west traffic. It's simpler construction. It accomplishes a lot of the same improvements that we would get from that south and east, but gives us a little bit more of a normal roadway network to work with. And what we saw, we also looked at the underpass. There was a lot of discussion about, having a bridge through the area not being desirable, but an underpass might be far less impactful. But as we started looking into the underpass, there's a lot of complications with it. It's much more costly to build an underpass than an overpass. There's a number of utilities through the area, and then there's also flooding risks and potential, severe flooding during storms, particularly as we look at various climate change projections. And then operations and maintenance costs get significantly higher as you have to have pumps and such for drainage considerations with underpasses. So we ended up not carrying the underpass forward into a detailed evaluation. So the next slide illustrates the grade separated alternative. And you'll notice we still have the quadrant roadway connecting from the south to the east and Revere Beach Parkway down to Fellsway. And you'll notice the bridge structure in the east-west direction going up and over the north-south roadways and those connector roadways. And what we end up with on the surface is some narrower roadways, but the roadways are still required to be intertwined around the structure, around some of those supporting piers and walls. So you end up with, a little bit of an atypical roadway network on the surface. And we're still, it's still necessary to make those connections directly between the south and the east. So you see some curved roadways under there. And again, a little bit narrower, a little bit, fewer lanes on the surface, but a slightly more complicated network and configuration. And you'll see a much higher cost, where the other at-grade alternatives were in the $30 million, $36 million range. This one's 5 to 6 times that cost, and quite a bit more expensive. And the other factor to consider with a grade separated alternative, if you go to the next slide, is really the separation and the barrier that it can present. And from a visual perspective, and this is an illustration from grade level of what that overpass would look like. And we have pulled back the retaining wall sections, tried to create as long of a span to keep it as open as possible. But even with those design elements, you still do have quite a barrier that would exist and create that underbridge environment that pedestrians and bicyclists would need to travel through. So if you go to the next slide, we'll start talking about the alternatives evaluation. And really, the alternatives evaluation was applied to those alternatives that I just walked through. If you go to the next slide. And it's really looking at the study goals. And there were 4 primary goals for the study. And those are informed by a number of evaluation criteria. And what we tried to do is really, for this evaluation, keep it fairly simple. Don't get, bogged down into arguments over the nuance of, a 1 to 10 scale. Is this a 6 or a 7 or, anything to that level of detail? We just said, look, 3 ratings, does it benefit this criteria? Is it neutral, or does it have negative impacts for this particular criteria? And those are the way that you'll see all of the results presented to you this evening. And with that, I will turn it over to Maureen to start talking about some of the first some of the first criteria that we looked at, which was improving safety.
Thank you, Gary. So throughout the development of the design, safety was definitely forefront in our minds. And as we talked about, we reduced some lanes and conflicts, which helps with the vehicle crashes. But you can see on this slide a number of elements that would be used to help the other modes of transportation in terms of crashes. At the onset of the project, we had looked at 3 years of crash data in the Wellington Circle area. And there's a tremendous number of accidents. There were 278 crashes over that 3-year period. Every intersection had pedestrian crashes, which is certainly alarming. And the high frequency of angle and sideswipe crashes between vehicles was also alarming. So these elements are used in the design. You'll see these features in the design. And again, safety was just our top priority. So on the next slide, we'll summarize how each of the alternatives scored, so to speak, in terms of safety. So every alternative is expected to reduce crashes in comparison to what's happening out there today. The short-term improvements have a marginal, are expected to marginally improve safety in the area. The build alternatives take it to a higher level with a lot more conflicts removed between each of the modes, the motorists, the pedestrians, the bicyclists. If you look at all the build alternatives, the grade separated alternative results in the fewest conflict points. Next slide. Now I'd like to walk you through some of the traffic analysis that was done. And again, we're going to talk about each mode of traffic that's out there. So we're kind of spelling our results right out at the beginning. And as you can see here, we evaluated how each mode of transportation works for each of the 4 alternatives. The short-term, the long-term at grade. The first one would be the square. The second one would be the triangle with transit enhancement. And then the third long-term is the grade separated. And as Gary had explained, we either said it was better, neutral, or it got worse. What we'd love to see is one row with all green checks, but that doesn't happen in Wellington. And what this says to us is really it's a balancing act. We can improve some aspects, but it's going to hurt other modes. So throughout, you can see the short-term improvements offer a little bit of improvement to the pedestrians. As we get into the long-term improvements, again, the walking and the biking improves with the at-grade alternatives. However, it's at the expense of some of the driver operations. And then as we get into the long-term grade-separated alternative, we perhaps improve vehicle operations, but we don't help the transit and walking. So keep this in mind as we go through the analysis. I'm going to speak to the vehicle operations, and then Emil will speak to the walking and ped operations. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so what's happened over the years is Wellington Circle has been tweaked over and over again, and there's been lanes added, more capacity for vehicles. The signals have been upgraded, changed in terms of phasing and timing. And so over the years, it's actually evolved into this like snarl of roadway and signals that really processes a lot of vehicle volume. As we look at it, it does that, which is a plus, but it does that with a high crash rate, and it's not multimodal at all. So again, keeping our goals in mind that we want to improve safety and we want to make this area multimodal, we start to dig into some of those vehicle operation features. So we aim to simplify the geometry to make it easier to travel through the circle. The at-grade alternatives do reduce vehicle capacity due to the lanes that are taken away. And all of the alternatives greatly enhance the ped and bike experience. So let's walk through each of these. I'm going to show you a series of slides that will provide some comparisons. And often when we talk about vehicle operations, we're talking about level of service. And level of service is a rating of vehicle delay. You know, again, our goal was not to make it so a motorist can travel very quickly through this area, but the level of service does offer us a measurement. So what we did is anything that fell in level service A through D, which is considered adequate, is shown in blue. As we get to level service E, you begin to see longer delays. And then you get into level service F. Well, we broke our level service F into 3 different categories. The first category, the orange color, shows that it's level service F, but all of the movements are under capacity. As we move into the red circle, it's level service F, so we have long delays and about half of our movements are operating over capacity. And then as you get to the darkest color, we see in level service F with more than half of our movements over capacity. So what you'll see on this slide, you can see the results of the existing 2020 conditions in comparison to the short-term improvement is shown on the right. And the big takeaway here, really, we see levels of service get a little bit worse with the short-term improvements, but we see that street network begin to get simplified. And as you'll see on the next slide, as we move along, this is gonna set up the basis for comparing all of the build alternatives. Because it's a large infrastructure project, we typically project out 20 years. You know, and as Gary said, we have accounted for some growth out there. We haven't designed for the growth, but the evaluations on all the build alternatives will be based on the 2040 conditions. So what you can see here is if we compare what's out there today, if we do nothing to the roadway system, you can see what we would expect to have happen by 2040. And some of the levels get worse as we move out 20 years from now. On the next slide, we're going to do a comparison between the 2040 no build to the at-grade square alternative. And as you look at again, I would ask you to look at the street network and how much simpler it is. So our focus has really become trying to manage the queues at those major intersections, you know, keeping the safety features in there, trying to get traffic through, processed as best we can, without worrying so much about levels of service. As we go on to the next slide, you will see the same type of comparison, this time with the at-grade triangle with transit enhancements. Very similar results to the at-grade square. And then lastly, we'll do a comparison of the future no build to the grade separated alternative. And this is the one time that we do see some improvements to vehicle operations. We see some of those intersections moving up to a level service E. However, you know, as we've mentioned before, this improves traffic operations for vehicles, but not for the other modes of traffic out at Wellington. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emil, who will concentrate on the non-motorized users on the roadway.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, so I am going to speak through the pedestrian, bicycle, and transit impacts of the different alternatives. So starting off, we are looking at pedestrian connectivity. So what we have kind of graphically highlighted here are the crossings that we think are improved under each alternative. So these might be shortened crossings. They might be crossings that are currently unsignalized that would become signalized. Or they might be areas where it's currently not possible to cross Wellington Circle, which would be under these alternatives. So we can see with short-term alternatives, this is option B shown here. You can see we have improved crossings mostly at the north and a little bit on the west side of the circle. Moving on to the next slide, we'll go through the long-term alternatives. Starting with the square, you can see most of the crossings are improved to some extent, many up at the north through the circle, and then we do open up some new crossings to the south. The one thing, as Gary mentioned here, which we're going to highlight, is that crossing on the far east side is not provided under any of the long-term at-grade alternatives, and that's an area where we could potentially incorporate that pedestrian bridge. Moving on to the triangle on the next slide, you'll see very similar results, improved crossings all around, but no crossing on the east side. And then if we go on to grade separated, this one is sort of the most difficult to compare to the other alternatives because it so fundamentally changes the nature of the circle. But what we see here is many crossings, which can be both a positive and a negative. The crossings do tend to be shorter than under the long-term alternatives. You know, you're often crossing only 2 to 3 lanes at a time. However, there is also that element of, some of these crossings are occurring underneath that highway overpass, highway style overpass, I should say. So then continuing with pedestrian connectivity onto the next slide, we sort of tried to quantify that. So when we were looking at the existing conditions, we identified this northwest corner to southeast corner crossing, sort of to use as our bellwether to sort of assess all these alternatives within these presentations. So looking for that northwest to southeast corner, we can see under the existing conditions requires about 6 different crossings across vehicle lanes. The short or medium term alternatives, specifically option A, would reduce that a little bit, get rid of one of those channelized crossings. And then you can see our long-term at-grade alternatives cut the number of crossings required for this specific route basically in half, with the grade separated being a little bit higher, back up to 4 crossings required. Moving on to the next slide, we'll start talking about the pedestrian delay or travel times. So this is again for that same route that we discussed on the last slide. This is how long does it take you to get from point A to point B. You can see under the existing conditions, it takes nearly 5 minutes on average, and about half of that time is spent waiting to cross the street. With the short-term improvements in place, you can see we save about a minute of travel time, most of which is that time that you're spent waiting, which is similar to the long-term grade separated alternative, in that it provides about a minute of saving. You can see the long-term grade separated actually provides a little bit of travel time savings in the sense that you're able to cross more directly through the middle of the circle. But then we see a real point of differentiation for our long-term at-grade alternatives. This would be basically any of them for this route. They're effectively the same. And those would be estimated to save about a minute and a half out of that 5-minute total crossing time, most of which would be time saved from waiting. And then I think the final aspect that we're going to talk about for pedestrians is just the overall pedestrian experience. How difficult or easy is it to walk through the circle? And one way we're going to try to quantify that is by looking at the number of pedestrian crossings of more than 3 lanes, which do not provide a pedestrian refuge island. This would be throughout the entire circle for all these alternatives. So you can see under the existing conditions, there are 8 of those types of crossings. And then for each of the alternatives, there are different amounts. The long-term at-grade square provides very few. It's about half as many as existing. One potential downside of that transit-enhanced triangle is that it does provide a little bit more of these crossings, in part because of the added bus lanes. And you can see, again, the long-term grade separated tends to provide shorter crossings in general. And then a final element on pedestrian experience, because it is obviously a major differentiator for these, is just the overall pedestrian kind of experience. Wellington Circle today obviously has very wide lanes. It has that tall, large highway kind of wayfinding style signage. In general, it feels very much like a highway and not an urban intersection. And I think one thing that we do think we can do with all of our alternatives, particularly the long-term at-grade alternatives, is to sort of bring things back. Obviously, it's still going to be quite a large roadway, quite a large intersection, but start to get things closer to more of a human scale and less of that highway feel, with the obvious exception of the grade separated alternative. Fundamentally, it's hard to kind of correct that highway style feel when there's an overpass over top of the roadway. So that is our kind of assessment of pedestrians, and moving on to bicycles next. So when we were talking about the bicycles, looking at the existing conditions at Wellington Circle, we looked at the surrounding bike networks where there is currently bike infrastructure provided. And if you see that gap that's circled in yellow there, you can see there's a big hole in the middle of the network, and that is Wellington Circle. Looking at the short-term alternative for bike connectivity, we do provide that opportunity for the the eastbound separated bicycle facility. So that specific movement through the circle is somewhat improved with the short-term alternatives. But then going on to the next slide, for really all of the long-term alternatives, grade separated or at grade, we think we can provide high quality separated bicycle facilities more or less throughout the entire circle. and really fill in that gap and connect to the surrounding bicycle infrastructure. I think of the benefits of the different alternatives we're looking at, this is certainly one of the major ones, is the potential to provide high quality bicycle facilities. And as we go on to the next slide, we actually tried to kind of quantify that into a chart. So this is the number of total approaches into the circle that we would expect would be able to provide high quality, high comfort bicycle facilities. You can see under existing conditions, none of the approaches really do. There's essentially no bicycle specific infrastructure out there. Short and medium term, let us add essentially one approach's worth of bicycle facilities. And then the long-term options, drastically more. The at-grade options, we expect that we'd be able to provide good bicycle facilities essentially on all approaches and throughout the circle. The grade separated is slightly worse, potentially because on the east side of the intersection, where you do have that bridge and a number of surface roadways as well, there may or may not be the space for the bicycle facilities, or at least for separated, signal separated, those sorts of bicycle facilities. And then moving on, finally, we're going to talk through kind of the transit impacts. So transit in Wellington Circle, there are two sort of elements to it. There is getting to Wellington Station, which we would expect the pedestrian and the bicycle improvements would help make it easier to get to Wellington Station, and there's that impact. But what we're looking at here specifically is for those bus routes through the circle that Gary was talking about. So these routes all come from the north on Fells Way and head over to Wellington Station. So like Maureen was saying, the long-term at-grade alternatives do show a reduction in vehicle capacity relative to the existing circle, and buses are using those surface roadways, so they are impacted by that. This chart shows the travel time savings. So those negative numbers suggest increases in travel time. So you can see the long-term at-grade and the long-term grade separated alternatives are shown to increase travel times by about 20 to 30 seconds. The long-term at-grade shown here is the square, by the way. And then that long-term at-grade triangle with the transit enhancements, we see not only does it reverse the travel time increase that we would expect to see under the long-term at-grade alternatives, it actually shows a pretty substantial decrease in travel time relative to existing conditions for the buses going through the circle. And we would probably expect that the triangle would be somewhere between that long-term at-grade shown on the left and that improved transit, the transit enhanced triangle. So with that, I believe I'm going to hand it off to Natalie, and she's going to talk through some of the other impacts that we are measuring as we analyze these alternatives.
So in addition to looking at different transportation factors as part of our alternatives analysis, we also looked at elements that would help improve quality of life. So that includes looking at environmental outcomes, land use and economic development, public health, and environmental justice populations. So starting off with looking at environmental outcomes, you can see here that overall, for the majority of alternatives and majority of environmental categories evaluated, we're expecting a neutral outcome. The majority of the project is looking at reconfiguring existing roadway space. So there aren't many significant environmental impacts with these alternatives. The exception to that would be the grade separated alternative, where because of the nature of the structure and taking up more space, there would be impacts to floodplains and open space. And then some of the notable benefits here are for the short, medium term, and long term at-grade alternatives that would increase the area of open space and recreational areas. And so we would see some benefits to those. And then another important thing to note is that all of these alternatives will need to go through the Section 106 historic and archaeological review process because the parkways through Wellington Circle are classified as historic resources. And so that would be an element that would be evaluated as the project moves forward. So moving on to land use and economic development. One of the things we looked at was consistency with the Medford master plan. The master plan sets goals for the community, and so we wanted to evaluate how these alternatives align with those goals. And as you can see here, the short, medium, long-term at-grade, and the transit enhanced alternatives align with those goals by improving multimodal connectivity and opportunities for placemaking. The long-term grade separated alternative has a neutral impact because although it improves connectivity for bicycles and pedestrians under the structure itself presents a visual barrier for the community, which would be inconsistent with those goals. And then as far as commercial driveway access, all access and driveways will be maintained for all alternatives, resulting in a neutral rating. And so we also wanted to understand the potential impacts of future development. And so we completed we call a what if scenario to see what would happen if certain build outs occurred in communities surrounding Wellington Circle. So that includes Medford, Everett, Malden, and Somerville. So all of these communities have plans for more intense reuse and redevelopment for parcels that are particularly currently industrial or highway commercial type uses. And so through this zoning scenario, they would be denser and bring more people to this area, whether they're employees or visitors or residents. And so the parcels that are expected to have denser development are shown in the colors here on this map. And so the main takeaway for this in terms of what it means is that with more people in this area and knowing that there's a limited opportunity to increase the vehicular traffic capacity, there is a need to increase travel by alternative modes in the future in this area. So then looking at public health, you can see here overall there are expected to be benefits across alternatives for each of the three categories evaluated. The benefits to air quality can be attributed to reduced emissions, and that's expected as a result of EPA and federal policies for vehicle fuel efficiency. There's an NA under the short medium term because that alternative was not included in the modeling, so that one just doesn't have the same result as the others. And also, given its short-term nature, there wouldn't be as much progress on meeting those future fuel efficiency standards. And then when looking at active transportation facilities and connectivity, as Emil just explained, there are opportunities throughout all of the alternatives, whether the short medium term is smaller for bicycle connectivity, but still benefits compared to the existing condition. And so all of these would be expected to improve opportunity to use both of these active modes more comfortably and frequently within the Wellington Circle area. And lastly, looking at safety, we expect it to be improved for all alternatives, as Maureen also discussed, by improving clarity in the circle and reducing conflict points for each mode. And another element we looked at to evaluate quality of life, we're calling community cohesion. And so again, the short, medium, and then long-term at-grade alternatives we see as reducing barriers between neighborhoods because of that enhanced multimodal connectivity that we would be provided from all neighborhoods surrounding the circle to another neighborhood. However, the grade separated alternative, while it has some improved connections for the at-grade roadways, the grade separated portion of that alternative would create a visual barrier between neighborhoods. We've learned from other areas nearby, such as McGrath Highway in Somerville, that overpass serves as a barrier, even if someone can technically walk under it or use transit under it. It still is a barrier for the community. And so lastly here, we look at the impact to environmental justice populations. Here we have a map showing where the populations are located. And as you can see, kind of all around Wellington Circle, the light orange is showing those that meet the minority threshold, and then the darker orange is showing the minority and low income thresholds. And the percentages on the map are showing where the percentages of car-free households surrounding the circle. So overall, our analysis shows that there's no disproportionate negative impacts to environmental justice populations compared to the population at large. And then we can even say that the alternatives are expected to benefit car-free, minority, and low-income households by improving multimodal connections to Wellington Circle. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Gary to summarize our results.
Thanks, Natalie. So overall, as Maureen pointed out, you don't see any one alternative that has nothing but green checks. There's no unanimous consensus decision amongst the alternatives. And really, these were the alternatives that were brought into the analysis. This is not a point at which we're making a recommendation. We're really presenting the results of the analysis, presenting the alternatives that were brought forth to go through this alternatives analysis so that we could assess them and identify which ones worked well for the project goals and which ones didn't. And you do see that from the vehicle operations perspective, as was talked about, the short, medium term, and then the at-grade alternatives are not designed or intended to improve vehicle operations and increase capacity, but they do very well in many of the other metrics for pedestrian and bicyclists, for safety, for a number of the public health and economic development and cohesion metrics as well. When you look at the grade separated, it does do well for vehicle operations, but it has either no real, positive benefit to a number of modes, pedestrians, transit, etc., and has the potential for some negative impacts in other areas such as public health. At the bottom row of this, you see a cost comparison for each of them. The short and medium term alternatives, as you would expect, comparatively lower dollar value, coming in a little bit above $6 million. The at-grade alternatives, both fairly comparable, a little bit higher cost for the added roadway width for the transit enhanced alternative, but both 37 to 38 million roughly. And then, like I said earlier, roughly 5-time multiple for the grade separated alternative. And that's where the bridge, as I noted, we didn't carry forward the underpass alternative, which would come with a much higher price tag on top of that, but would probably have many of the same results from an operations and from the overall project objectives perspective. So with that, I believe our next slide is to open it up to public comment. And with that, I'll open it up, pass it off to Michaela if she wants to moderate that.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, it is now time to open it up for the question and answer portion of tonight's meeting. And as we move to the next slide, is this one kind of showed a little recap of some of the alternatives that were reviewed today. As a reminder, please use the raise hand button to participate verbally. You will then be recognized and you will receive a notification on your screen to unmute at that time. Please note that the notification will show up on your primary Zoom screen, just in case other windows might be open, such as the Q&A. To utilize ASL services, please let the team know through the Q&A, and the team will provide video sharing capabilities. If you're participating by phone, please dial *9 to raise your virtual hand. And I'd first like to open up the floor for comments from any elected officials or members of their staff in attendance tonight. And seeing no hands raised at the moment, I think I'd now like to open it up to members of the public in attendance. And we already have a few questions in the Q&A. So thank you all for joining and participating and sharing your comments and questions. Please continue to use the Q&A to share any comments or questions that you might have. And so we will start off with Gretchen, who asks, what are the strategies being considered to create development parcels from the reconfiguration of streets? Active building frontages near the back of wider sidewalks with trees would go a long way to help pedestrians walking through the area. Joanne, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Hi, Gretchen. This is Joanne Harris. Glad you've joined us. So as Gary said, our job was focused really on looking at the square, looking at Medford Circle itself, Wellington Circle itself, and really trying to reconfigure that. However, the city planner and engineering staff are also a big important part of our working group, and simultaneously with our process of looking at Wellington Circle from a transportation perspective, they undertook a master planning process for the city of Medford. And so they have identified Wellington Circle and Mystic Valley Parkway as an area where they would like to see more dense mixed use walkable types of development. And so working hand in hand with the city, any further development of this project would address the specific question that you have in probably in more detail.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I next see a raised hand from Amy. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. No, I appreciate this presentation tonight, and I think you guys made some really great decisions, and I appreciate the kind of focus on, you know, not necessarily improving the situation and stuff for cars, not trying to make that the main focus, and trying to, balance things out a little bit more, which I know is a challenge in such a busy intersection or series of intersections. But yeah, I just want to say, I think that what came out is really good. I do hope that we can continue to kind of push the envelope on that with the, rebalancing of this intersection and maybe even compromising a little bit more throughput just to get things, a little bit more human scale. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. I next see a question in the Q&A from Jason related to the grade separated alternative. Gary, do you want to take that one to talk a little bit about the alternatives development process and why the grade separated alternative was carried through to this point for the purpose of analysis?
Yeah, and as I noted, these were the alternatives that were carried forward, for the purpose of analysis. These are not recommendations. And really with the volumes that we're looking at and some of the information that Maureen shared, comparing it to other locations, having a grade separated alternative is really something that needs to be part of the process. Otherwise, if somebody's going to look at this to advance the project and look back and think, there's a glaring omission here where you didn't have a grade separated alternative. Geez, didn't you guys look at that? So we did, we looked at it, we included it, we ran it through the analysis, and the results were presented tonight. We'll consider those as we go towards the recommendation phase. With regards to that being an elevated grade separation as opposed to a tunnel or boat section as they would call it, that really was just driven by some of the constructability issues and cost issues that would come in if we tried to do something below grade that I touched upon, that would further skew that and drive the costs even higher without really offering any benefit other than from a visual perspective. So we did not include the below grade alternative for it and just carried in the above grade alternative.
Thank you. And thank you, Jason, for the question. I next see a raised hand from Scott. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Hi, thank you. Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. And thank you for holding this meeting. The kind of question I had is, so I've been a bike commuter through this intersection for a long time. And I was a little concerned that the short and medium term plan didn't have anything for those of us that bike on the Fellsway. And I just want to know if there's any thought or if there's any way to add, even if it's not a fully protected lane, but any sort of improvement, because I mean, it's pretty bad right now.
Yeah, it is. And because we weren't really changing things in the north-south direction, we didn't show anything in there. As those go into design development, there's certainly opportunities to look at, and is there ways to repurpose some of that pavement or adjacent space to better accommodate bikes. I know there are some other improvements happening, adjacent to the project that might create opportunities to tie into it. So that's something that certainly can be evaluated. They're not easily accommodated without, within the context of the alternatives that we develop for that short-term and medium-term alternatives.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I next see a question in the Q&A from Jason, who asks about the green space in the middle for the square and triangle concepts, and asks about whether it's been considered moving the roadways together and increasing green space on the sides.
And I don't know if you want to go back a slide where we can see the alternatives, that might help. So the prior slide has it. So really, because of the connection points that we have, the alignments of the roadways are almost, dictated to us. You have Middlesex Ave, you have Fells Way, and obviously the parkways. So trying to bring them in a little bit tighter, isn't something that's easily accomplished. And, normally, yes, we'd like to move that open space so that it's adjacent to, some of the areas, some of the abutting land uses that may better benefit from them. There may be an opportunity to bring the two primary intersections slightly closer together, but because they are two intersections, you have signals operating at both. You have to be able to have some space for those vehicles to queue and to travel through. There's not an ability to really condense them down, or you end up with that, single intersection alternative that I talked about at the very beginning that ends up needing more and more lanes. So, what we tried to do with developing the open space, particularly on the square alternative, is to minimize that Middlesex Ave leg to the extent that we can. So, there's 3 lanes that are there. We have, bicycle lanes or bicycle facilities and sidewalks to try to buffer those. There's ample space for landscaping. I believe there's another question about the size of those. That's about the size of a football field in rough scale. So it's a good size open space that gives you some opportunities to do some things to make it feel a little bit less like you're in the middle of a highway. The triangle alternative and the transit enhanced don't give you as much space within that center area and require wider roadways on either side. So, they don't provide as much usable space in there, but they do have, that triangular piece that you see in the top right that is contiguous to abutting parcels, as well as on the top left, that depending on how those properties develop over time, they may be able to better use some of those areas, although they're smaller, to connect in with those properties.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. And thank you all for your comments and questions tonight. Again, just as a quick reminder, if you'd like to share your comments or questions verbally, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or continue to type any comments or questions that you might have into the Q&A. And so with that, I next see a question from Jason, who asks, will the Middlesex and Fellsway intersection be signalized?
In the square alternative, it will be, and Emil, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the square alternative, it will be signalized. And then in the triangle alternative, was that one also signalized, or would that be stop controlled?
So specifically, the 9th Street at Middlesex portion would be proposed to remain stop controlled for the triangle alternatives, but the Fellsway at Middlesex would be signalized for all of the alternatives, essentially, including the short term.
Yes.
Thank you. I next see a question from Gretchen, or 2 questions rather. And Gary, you touched on the first question a little bit earlier in terms of what's the scale of the open space between the reconfigured roadways. And then Gretchen's second question was, how might that open space compare to other known open spaces with significant traffic flows adjacent?
Yeah, and I think I answered the first part of it. The second part's a little tougher to answer because the volumes in this area are unique. And I don't know offhand the exact volume that would be on the roadway to the east of the square area as well, but that would be considerably lower, and that may be more accessible and again give the ability to connect that green space to the abutting land uses and the abutting residential community. The volumes traveling through here, east-west and connecting off between the south and the east are significant. So they're certainly higher than a lot of other areas that you might see that would have park space in the middle. If you think of a Comm Ave or something that has a wide median that is, inviting and open, but that's lower volume, lower speed roadways alongside of it. But we did try to set up that square so that, at least elements of it and that east side of it is lower volume, it's lower speed, so that it can be a little bit more inviting. And there's, as I noted at the beginning, a long way to go getting urban designers involved and landscape architects as the designs advance to make sure that those connections are really there and solid and, you know, not and make that space inviting for everybody.
Thank you. I next see a question from Sam. Sam says, I live on 9th Street and asks, how will I get there from the south and west with the alternatives if the end of Middlesex is moved?
So from the south, you can simply continue north on Fells Way and turn right when you get up to the connector road, whether it's, you know, under either alternative, and it's just a question of whether you're turning right or if you're going straight through with the triangle alternative. Honestly, if you're coming from the west, you know, you wouldn't have an ability to turn left through these intersections, and you end up having to use Commercial Street to the west, or, you know, depending on certain times of day, you may not want to do this, but going off to the east and reversing directions at some of the roadways, whether it's Riverside or further to the east to come back into the area. And that really was just, you know, left turns are traffic engineers, you know, worst enemy. And, you know, we're always looking at opportunities of where you can relocate, you know, accommodate those in other manners. And that one's a relatively low volume left turn that we just didn't see an opportunity to accommodate. You know, there may be the ability further south at the intersections to accommodate U-turn movement or some sort of a, you know, turnaround. But we really didn't get to that level of detail within this alternatives development process.
I next see a question in the Q&A from Caitlin asking, is it possible to do the triangle alternative, keeping with the same number of lanes as the square design, but dedicating one of them to transit so that the total number of lanes is not increased, but instead for motor vehicles, there will be a decreased lane. And Caitlin expresses a concern about the number of lanes in the area.
Yeah, and we really did start to, you know, we took a hard look at, can we further reduce lanes? And while, you know, looking at it at this scale, it looks like in a number of locations, there's, you know, many lanes and, you know, in some locations, there are more lanes than we would have liked to have gotten to. When we really peel it down, you know, there's a single right turn lane. There's a double left turn lane to accommodate the heavy, you know, westbound to southbound left turn lane. And then there's only 2 through lanes left. So, you know, when you start to peel it down and break it down into those individual layers, you know, we really don't have the ability to easily take away another lane from some of those key movements. You know, in order to get that westbound left turn from 2 lanes to 1, you would need a heavy, you know, a significant decrease in overall traffic volumes. That doesn't mean there's no place where you couldn't, you know, perhaps there's the southbound, you know, through movement where we could remove a lane as the design advances, or, you know, in an eastbound direction, there may be specific approaches where you can, but there's not a lot of ability to further eliminate lanes through the designs that are developed. As far as the transit and repurposing that, what we were seeing, and we did start there, particularly with that southbound direction. You'll notice in the northbound direction, we do repurpose that lane. We are not adding a lane. We are repurposing that rightmost lane to be transit. There's a shared element of it where it needs to accommodate right turns as well as transit vehicles. But in the southbound direction, what we saw when we took away that lane and tried to dedicate it to transit was, you know, the overall operations degraded to the point that even the transit vehicles start to get impacted. So we ended up going with the alternative to add that lane in. Again, as designs advance and you know, further analysis is done, and you know, further information or data about traffic volume patterns, you know, come to light, and we're seeing lots of other bus lanes and transit facilities being constructed that are decreasing vehicle capacity and doing it successfully. So, you know, there may be chances as the design is further developed to make some of those changes that you're talking about. But at this point, with the information and the data that we have, you know, we felt we had, you know, the number of lanes that we needed to advance this through the alternatives analysis.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I next see a raised hand from Julia. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all your hard work. First of all, us in Somerville appreciate it for sure. But I think my question is, with pavement markings currently, a lot of people don't follow the pavement markings. They go in separate lanes, they cut people off. Is there a way that we could better enforce pavement markings, or will they be more coherent with these short/medium term plans, or what are you thinking?
So we are thinking, well, if you look at the short and medium term, and probably one of the biggest challenges is you have a triple left turn coming from westbound to southbound due to that heavy volume that you have through there. We really aren't changing that with the existing intersection geometry. You need those 3 lanes. We are reducing the number of lanes on the eastbound direction. So, we're removing that eastbound to northbound left turn. We're hopeful that cleans up the intersection a little bit, makes it a little less confusing because you'll have a little more of a curb line and defined edge to help guide drivers, visually, in addition to the pavement markings, which, particularly at this time of year, whether there's salt on the road or pavement markings get a little worn out, may not be as effective as you'd like. But there's not a lot of wholesale changes in that westbound direction to the pavement markings. Similarly, on the north side, where we're taking out that additional approach to the intersection, and you'll have a clean, better defined roadway edge, we're hopeful that those provide a little bit better guidance for vehicles to track a little more normally, as opposed to the existing geometry of the intersection.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. We next have a question in the Q&A from Caitlin, who asks, what would be the speed limits on these roads in the new configuration, and how would they compare to what the speed limits are now?
So these are the designs are generally developed for a 35-mile-an-hour design speed. At this level of design, we haven't really, beyond setting some parameters so that we know the designs are feasible. We haven't gotten to the level of detail of clearly defining a design speed. There's vertical elements to it as well. I believe the speeds through the area are generally going to be, in free flow conditions, are generally going to be a little bit higher than that through some of the approach roadways. And we can look at design elements as you get further in with, changing, reducing lane widths, putting in some other, visual elements roadside that, can be effective at reducing vehicle speeds, even beyond what the design speed may be.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I next see a couple of questions in the Q&A from Nancy. The first being, did the fact that 9th Street is a private way and there is soon to be an 8-story, 260 plus unit development expected where Cappy's is located factor into the proposals?
So, whether it's a private roadway or a public roadway, we considered the access for 9th Street for that community. I know we heard early on a lot of feedback about 9th Street serving as a cut through that happens during certain times of the day. And we were focused on trying to come up with alternatives that didn't increase delay and congestion to the point that it exacerbated that problem. We did have a number of development projects in and around the area that are considered into it. Honestly, mixed use developments, residential developments that abut the immediate project area would be beneficial and would be well supported by a number of the improvements for pedestrian and bicycle connectivity for those that are accessing the nearby commercial properties or other restaurants and retail locations, and as well as the train station. So we feel as though that would fit well. And we did make sure that we have the ability to maintain access to those properties as their development plans get further developed or further considered.
And the second question from Nancy asks, when people on 9th Street need to head to work in Boston each morning, how do they best access Route 28 South?
So that's, depending on which alternative, it's really, you're going to come out of 9th Street, and whether you're going straight across the intersection on the connector road and turning left onto Fellsway, or if you're kind of angling to the left in the triangle concept and, continuing down to the south, straight through onto Fellsway. So it's a direct connection coming into it. That should actually work out pretty well for you. If it were the grade separated alternative, it's going to work similar to the square, where you're going to go straight off of 9th and then turn left onto Fellsway.
And I next see a comment from Amy in the Q&A related to some of that separation of bike and peds from the roadway, and asks about an option of doing a modern looking multi-pronged pedestrian overpass. So Gary, can you talk a little bit about some of those types of options?
Sure. Yeah, the design that was evaluated and considered, it was a bridge that gets across there for pedestrians. It was not, something that went through an extensive design process or architectural evaluation to come up with something that's aesthetically pleasing. That would get to the next phase. This is really looking at it as an alternative and considering its feasibility and benefits. So, it's a somewhat utilitarian design in that regard. There was a lot of questions and comments that we've gotten from the working group about doing something, more elaborate, in some of the European style ones that will have fully elevated crossings for all legs of an intersection. Some of the challenges that we're seeing with that is really the grades. And in the areas where those work well, they work best when you have elevated geography around the intersection, that you can work with the topography to develop a grade separated pedestrian crossing that, ties in without requiring, whether it's pedestrians or bicyclists, to, go up large inclines and increases in elevation that can, take some energy and not be very inviting. And what we end up with in terms of providing ramps that achieve accessibility, you have long run out lengths. You end up with a structure that's going to be 22 feet in the air. And if you're just doing, a 5% grade, you can see how long that's going to take you. You're talking 400 feet, plus you need brakes for, level landing areas for, accessibility, so that folks have brakes along the way, and aren't just on a straight incline the entire direction. So you end up with a connection that gets quite removed from the intersection if you're not doing those switchback type ramps. And we don't feel that fits in as well with the surrounding land uses. You'd be beyond many of them before you're able to connect back to grade. So, we did look at those treatments, and we really felt like the one crossing that we have is the one that works, to fill in that gap that we weren't able to achieve at grade. But in the other locations where we have the at-grade crossings, we're able to do it, with protected crossings, with median refuge islands, to make sure that, they are crossings that are far more comfortable than they are today. We felt that was a better solution for pedestrian and bicycle accessibility through the intersections.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any additional raised hands or comments or questions in the Q&A at this time. So I think we'll give it a moment or so before we transition to next steps for this process. All right, so Natalie, I think we can go to the next steps slides. So in terms of some of our next steps, this slide details the study schedule, including the anticipated working group and public meetings. And the next slide talks a little bit more about some of our next steps for the study. The input received from the working group and the public will assist in the development of the study's recommendations. And so next, our working group meeting and public meetings are anticipated to be held early 2023, which is soon approaching, to present the draft recommendations. So for more information on the study or to share questions or comments following tonight's meeting, please visit our study website. And I encourage you all to sign up for updates on our website if you haven't already. The materials from this meeting, including the video recording, will be made available on our study website. And so with that, that concludes tonight's meeting. Thank you all again for joining us and for sharing your comments and questions with us, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you all.